Friends, welcome to the channel The Dental Educators. Today we will be discussing about the permanent mandibular central incisors. So we know that the mandibular central incisors are two in number which are present in the mandibular arch. So let's start with a brief introduction about the incisors in the mandibular arch. So if we see here, the mandibular incisors are four in number. Basically, if we talk about the permanent mandibular central incisors, they are two in number, but in total, the mandibular incisors are four in number. So if we can see through this video demonstration, counting the mandibular incisors, this is the central incisor of the right hand side, and similarly lateral of right, central and lateral of the left hand side. So we can count 1, 2, 3 and 4. We have four incisors which are present in the mandibular arch. Now if we talk about the description or the location of the permanent mandibular central incisors, we can see that the mandibular central incisors are centered in the mandible on either side of the midline. So you can see here we have drawn an imaginary midline here in this diagrammatic representation in the center, which is present between the two incisors, both of the left hand side and of the right hand side respectively. So basically we can see both of these central incisors will share the mesial surface with each other, and because the mesial surface of both of these central incisors will come in contact with each other in the mandibular arch. Now if we see in this video demonstration, you can easily see that this is the central of left and center of right. So both of them are sharing the mesial contact with each other. Both of them have the mesial contact with each other, and both of them are on the either side of the midline. This is the left central incisor, this is the right central incisor, which are adjacent to the midlines respectively. Now when we look at the dimensions of the permanent mandibular central incisors, they are said to be smaller and mediodistal dimension as compared to any of the anterior tooth. So they have the smallest mediodistal dimension. So you can easily identify this. The mediodistal dimension of these permanent mandibular central incisor, as we can see in this diagrammatic representation, it's quite less in comparison to the any other tooth inside the oral cavity. Now if you look through this video demonstration, you can easily identify the mediodistal dimension of these mandibular central incisors of both right and left hand side. It's quite less if you see for the left hand side and for the right, and when you compare it with any other teeth in the maxillary arch or any other tooth in the mandibular arch like the lateral incisors, canines and so on, the mediodistal dimension of the mandibular central incisor, it is quite less in comparison to the any other tooth inside the maxillary or the mandibular arch respectively. Now when you further on compare the total dimension in comparison to the lateral incisors, we see that the central incisors are smaller in both dimensions in comparison to the lateral incisors. Which two dimension? That is the incisor cervically and mesiodistally. So if you could appreciate, incisor cervically, it's less in dimension in comparison to the mandibular lateral incisors. Similarly, mesiodistally as well, it is less in comparison to the mandibular lateral incisor. So if we go through this video demonstration, we can easily identify that the mandibular central incisor of the left hand side, if we compare it, it has less incisor cervical dimension and mesiodistal dimension in comparison to the lateral incisor of the left hand side in the incisor cervical and mesiodistal dimension. Similarly, when you compare the mandibular central incisor of the right hand side, the incisor cervical dimension is less in comparison to the incisor cervical dimension of the lateral incisor of the right hand side. So the dimensions of the mandibular central incisor, both incisor cervically and mesiodistally, is less in comparison to the mandibular lateral incisors. Now further on, mammals are worn off on the incisal edges as soon the tooth has erupted into the oral cavity when the tooth is inside the occlusion. So you can see here the mamelons are worn off. You can't see the mamelons in these mandibular central incisors. Similarly, in the video demonstration as well, you can easily identify that the mamelons which should have been present, and they are present in newly erupted incisor, they are worn off. So the incisal edge appears to be straight, as the the mamelons which are present on these incisors are worn off, so they appear to be straight in direction. Now, talking about the tooth numbering systems for the mandibular central incisor. So as we already learned in the previous videos, that we have three different type of tooth numbering systems: universal, Palmer, and FTI. So as per the universal numbering system, if you could recall, we count all of the teeth in the oral cavity. So you have 16 teeth in the maxillary arch. After the 16 teeth, you start to count the teeth in the mandibular arch. So for the mandibular left central incisor, or like this one, we will call it as tooth number 24, whereas the tooth on the right hand side will be called as tooth number 25. So if we go through this video demonstration, we can easily count the teeth as per the universal numbering system. So starting with the maxillary right third molar, 1, 2, 3 for the first, 4 for the second premolar, 5 for the first premolar, 6 for the canine, 7 for the lateral incisor, 8 for the central incisor of the maxillary arch, now 9 for the left central incisor, 10 for the left lateral incisor, 11 for the canine in the maxillary arch, 12 for the first premolar of the left hand side, 13, 14 for the first molar of the left hand side, 15 for the second molar, and 16 for the third molar. So we counted 16 teeth in the maxillary arch. Now coming down, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 for the premolar, 22, 23, and now 24 for the lateral incisor, and 25 for the lateral incisor of the right hand side. So tooth number 24 and tooth number 25. 24 for the lateral incisor of the lower left hand side, and we count 25 for the lower right hand side as per universal numbering system. Now as per the next numbering system, that is the Palmer notation system, so we already know that we only make up the main thing, that is the symbolic representation, because the Palmer notation system is basically the symbolic representation. So we make up a symbol like this for the lower right hand side, and as the mandibular central incisor is the first tooth from the midline on the right hand side, so we mark it as tooth number 1. Similarly, for the left hand side, we make up a symbol like this, mentioning that this is the mandibular arch quadrant on the left hand side, like this. This is the mentioning, or by this we can easily identify that this is the quadrant of the lower left hand side. Then as the mandibular central incisor on the left hand side is the first tooth from the midline, so we will write it down as tooth number 1. Now if you go through this video demonstration, you can easily identify the symbols which we make. So for the lower left hand side, we make up a horizontally flipped L shape, and for lower right hand side we make up a symbol like this. So after making up a symbol like this for the lower left hand side, we will count the teeth from the midline for the lower left hand side. So the central incisor on the left hand side is number 1 tooth, so after making this quadrant we will write tooth number 1. Similarly, on the right hand side we will make up a quadrant shape like this for the lower right hand side, and then as it's the first tooth from the midline on the lower right quadrant, we will make quadrant shape like this and write tooth number 1 for the lower right hand side. Now as per the third type of tooth numbering system, that is the FDI notation system. In the FDI notation system, if you could recall, we mark up the quadrant first. So each and every quadrant is given a specific number. So in permanent dentition, we basically have 4 quadrants. In the maxillary arch you have two, and in the mandibular arch you have two quadrants as well. So it makes up four quadrants in total. So you can easily identify the upper right quadrant is known as quadrant number 1, upper left as quadrant number 2, lower left is referred as quadrant number 3. So you can see that we mentioned it, the lower left is the quadrant number 3, and as the central incisor is the first tooth from the midline, so we will write it as 3 1. Now the lower right quadrant is mentioned as quadrant number 4, so we write it as quadrant number 4. Then as the central incisor is the first tooth from the midline, so we write it as 4 1 for the lower right central incisor. Now as we go through this video demonstration, you can easily understand the tooth numbering system. So 1 2 3 4, we have four quadrants as we discussed earlier as well. So starting with the first one, which is for the lower left quadrant, so you can easily identify that for the lower left quadrant we will write as quadrant number 3, and then the mandibular central incisor on the left hand side is the first tooth. Now for the lower right quadrant, it is the quadrant number 4, so we will write it as quadrant number 4 for the lower right hand side. Then the mandibular central incisor is the first tooth from the midline, so we will write it as 4 1. Now when we look at the features on the labial aspect of the mandibular central incisors, it is said that the mesial and distal incisal angles are very sharp or at the 90 degrees for both of the central incisors. So you can easily identify that the mesio-incisal angle of both lower right and left central incisor are quite sharp. Mesio-incisal angles are sharp. Similarly, we say that the disto-incisal angle of both of these mandibular central incisors are quite sharp enough. They have a very sharp edge for both of these mandibular central incisors. Now if we go through the video demonstration showing the incisal angles, so you can see the disto-incisal angle, it is nearly at right angle. Similarly, the mesio-incisal angle for the left mandibular central incisor, it's also at right angle. The mesio-incisal angle for the lower right central incisor and the disto-incisal angle for the same lower right central incisor are both at the 90 degrees. So we can say they are at a very sharp angle. Now when you look at the incisal ridge of the crown, it is straight and it's approximately at the 90 degrees to the long axis of the tooth. So if you see at the long axis of the tooth, it appears to be at the 90 degrees. This is the long axis of the tooth. So the incisal edge of the mandibular central incisors, they appear to be quite straight, nearly at 90 degrees to the long axis of the tooth. Now if you see through this video demonstration, you can easily identify that the mandibular central incisors, their incisal edges are quite straight, nearly at the 90 degrees to the distal angle and the mesial angle for this lower left central incisor. Now similarly, for the lower right central incisor, you can see the incisal edge is nearly at the 90 degrees to the mesial and the distal surface, that is to the long axis of the tooth surface. Now if you further on identify some features on the labial aspect of the mandibular central incisor, so you can see here we have some features of developmental lines which can be easily identified on the labial aspect of both of the mandibular central incisors. So you can easily identify that we have two developmental lines which are present on the labial aspect of the mandibular central incisor. So basically it divides the mandibular central incisor in three parts, 1, 2 and 3. So we can call these parts as lobes as well. So these parts are basically known as the lobes. If you go through different texts, so you can again see in this mandibular central incisor as well, you have two developmental lines. Okay, so these two developmental lines are basically dividing the mandibular central incisor in three parts, 1, 2 and 3. So these three parts are basically referred as the lobes. Now if we go through this video demonstration, you can easily identify we have some lines which are present on the mandibular central incisor labial aspects. Now when you go to the lingual aspect of the mandibular central incisor, we see that there is a slight concavity between the incisal edges and the marginal ridges for the lingual fossa. So you can easily identify a nice depression which is present on the lingual aspect. You can see the one margin is made by the incisal edge, and the two other borders for this lingual fossa are made by the mesial and distal marginal ridges. So you can easily identify you have two marginal ridges. One on the mesial side, it will be referred as the mesial marginal ridge, whereas the marginal ridge on the distal aspect will be referred as the distal marginal ridge. So you have two marginal ridges which are making up the boundaries in addition to the incisal ridge area. Okay, so there is a nice concavity which can be observed on the lingual aspect of the both of the mandibular central incisors. Now if you go through this video demonstration which is showing the lingual aspect of the mandibular central incisor, you can see you have two marginal ridges, mesial and the distal marginal ridge. So between the two marginal ridges, mesial and distal, above the cingulum, just below the incisal ridge area, you have a shallow concavity. This shallow concavity which you see on the lingual aspect, it is referred as the lingual fossa, which is present in both of the mandibular central incisors, in the right mandibular central incisor as well as the left mandibular central incisor. Now furthermore, you see a convexity in the cervical third area of the mandibular central incisor. If you would appreciate, this is a shallow convexity which can be observed in the cervical third area. Why we call it as the cervical third? Because it is closer to the cervical line. That's why this area of the tooth, it's referred as the cervical third area. So we see a convexity in this area which is referred as the cingulum. Now if we go through this video demonstration, you can see in the cervical third area of the right mandibular central incisor and in the cervical third area of the left mandibular central incisor, you can see a concavity is there, a shallow concavity. This concavity is basically referred as the cingulum. Now going on to the mesial aspect of the mandibular central incisor. So we see that the incisal ridges are rounded or worn off and they appear to be flat. If you appreciate on the top edge area of the mandibular central incisors, they appear to be flat or worn off. Okay, they have a rounded appearance. Now furthermore, when you draw up a straight line from the apex of the tooth, so you can see that the incisal edges or incisal ridges area, it's usually placed lingual to the line made in the center of the root. So you can see they are more lingually inclined. These incisal ridges, they are towards the lingual side. This is the lingual aspect. So they are more lingually inclined. Similarly, in the other mandibular central incisor, you can see that they are more lingually inclined, the incisal ridges. When you make up a straight line in the center from the apex of the root, you can easily identify, after making up this straight line, we can appreciate that the incisal ridges are more lingually inclined when you observe the tooth from the mesial aspect. Now furthermore, when you see the cervical line curvature on the mesial aspect, the cervical line represents the cemento-enamel junction on the mesial surface. It's marked incisally. Okay, so if you appreciate the cemento-enamel junction and the cervical line on the mesial aspect, it is more towards the incisal aspect. The curvature is towards the incisal aspect. So you can see this is the curvature which you can appreciate, it is more towards the incisal aspect for both of the mandibular central incisors. So when you see through the animations, you can see it's more curved towards the incisal aspect. The cervical line curvature, it's more towards the incisal ridge for both of the mandibular central incisors. It's curving towards the incisal ridge area. Now when you see the cervical line on the distal aspect, it curves in the same way as it was curving for the mesial aspect. Why we say so? Because the cervical line curvature, it is still curving incisally, if you could appreciate here. It's curving incisally towards the incisal ridge area, both for the left and the right mandibular central incisor. It's curving this shape, it's curving incisally. But the curvature of this cemento-enamel junction, this cervical line, it's nearly 1 millimeter less if you compare it with that of the cervical line curvature on the mesial aspect. Now the distal surface of the crown and root of mandibular central incisor has same kind of features which we see on the mesial aspect. What was that? If you could recall, in the previous slide we discussed that if we make up a line passing in the midline of the root, then you will see that the incisal ridge, it's placed lingually. Similarly, if you could appreciate the incisal ridge area, it's placed lingually on the distal aspect as well. So it's like a similar kind of features which you see both for the mesial and the distal aspects of the mandibular central incisors. Now coming on to the incisal aspect, that is the last aspect for the mandibular central incisors. So the incisal aspects illustrate that it appears to be bilateral symmetrical for the mandibular central incisors. What does it mean? If you would appreciate here, the mesial aspect appears to be similar to the distal aspect. So we say that it's bilaterally symmetrical. So you can see here, this aspect, the mesial one, it is similar to the distal aspect for the mandibular central incisor of the lower left hand side. Similarly, the mesial aspect for the right hand side of the right hand mandibular central incisor, it's similar to the incisal aspect, the distal aspect of the mandibular central incisor of the right hand side. So both mesial and distal, they appear to be symmetrical or same. That's why we say that it is bilaterally symmetrical. Now going through the video demonstration for the mandibular central incisors, you can appreciate here in this video that the both aspects, the mesial and distal for the mandibular central incisors, are same. You can see here this mesial aspect appears to be similar to the distal aspect, so we can say it's bilaterally symmetrical. Both sides, mesial and distal half for the mandibular central incisor and the third quadrant, are same, both of these halves. Now similarly, if you draw up a line in the center for dividing it into two halves, you can see that the mesial half of the mandibular central incisor, it's similar to the distal half. So we can say it appears to be bilaterally symmetrical, that the mesial and the distal halves are appearing to be symmetrical. Now furthermore, we see some more features on the incisal aspect of the mandibular central incisors. These features include that the incisal edge is not approximately at the right angles to the line bisecting labiolingually. So if you see the line which is bisecting labiolingually, it's approximately at the right angle of the incisal ridge. So you can easily identify this incisal ridge is at the right angle to the line which is bisecting labiolingually. So if you see here, a right angle can be easily formed between the two lines. The line which is going incisally and labiolingually, you can see a nice right angle can be easily developed between these two lines. So now going through the video demonstration, we can see that for the mandibular central incisor, that the labiolingually and incisal lines are cutting to each other at the 90 degrees angle. So if you make up a line now which is you can see on the incisal ridge it is straight. So if you make up a straight line, it cuts the line, if you imaginary line, at 90 degrees labiolingually. So now you make up an incisal ridge line and then labiolingual line, you can see it is cutting it at the 90 degrees angle to each other on the incisal view for the mandibular central incisors. Now, in addition to that, it is seen on the incisal view that the labial surface of the crown, so you can see this is the labial surface of the mandibular central incisors, it appears to be in the incisal third area, it appears to be broader and flat. So you can see it is in the incisal third area, the labial surface appears to be more broader and flat. So if you make up a curvature by imaginary lines, so it can be easily identified that it appears to be more broader and flat in the incisal third area on the labial aspect. Okay. Now on the incisal aspect, you see furthermore feature that the lingual surface of the crown at incisal third has some inclination towards the concavity, that is the lingual fossa. So if we draw up an imaginary line for it, a nice inclination can be observed, this kind of inclination which we see on the lingual aspect, which is showing a slight concavity for the formation of the lingual fossa on the lingual aspect of both of them permanent mandibular central incisors. Now if you go through this video demonstration, you can easily identify that we have a shallow concavity which basically presents for the space for the lingual fossa. Now when you see for the mandibular central incisor, you can see a shallow concavity is appearing on the lingual aspect to show the lingual fossa space. Similarly, you see a slight concavity area and inclination showing the area for the lingual fossa for both of the mandibular central incisors of the right and the left hand side respectively. So that's all for today's lecture. If you have any questions or queries, you can get back to us and we can discuss about them in the question areas in the comment box. See you in the next lecture soon. Good luck.